say how deeply troubled I am and members of my organization are with what happened, what we saw happen out in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with the officer who had his knee on the neck of an African-American male for more than 8 minutes. You know, it just appalls me when I see that. That's not indicative of the treatment and the way that we treat any citizen. And I don't see how anybody can view that as anything other than murder. I agree with the district attorney's decision to charge that officer with murder, and with his decision to charge those other officers that stood by with additional charges. And certainly, I, as a police chief, want to extend my condolences to the Floyd family. And I also want to remind folks that, you know, there's over 800,000 law enforcement officers that are out serving our communities. The vast majority of them are doing a great job. They are caring and compassionate people who do a great job in very difficult circumstances. Now, that being said, there are, you know, folks that slip through the cracks that don't have any business being police officers. And I agree that we need social justice, criminal justice reform to try to do a better job about keeping those folks that have no business being police officers off our police departments, and about trying to give our officers the training, the tools, the equipment, and giving them the tactics that's going to help them to be able to be more effective at dealing with our communities. So that being said, I know that was a lot. I wanted to get through that. The second question that you asked me dealt with the number of police-involved shootings that we had last year. And you know, the issue that's being played out across America with all of the protests and everything that's going on right now is an issue that's specifically related to how people of color are treated by law enforcement officers. And the police-involved shootings that we had last year are a very different issue. I'll talk about the underlying factor in those cases, which was primarily mental health and mental crisis issues. So it's a very different issue, but I will take a minute to summarize those shootings. We did have an unprecedented number of shootings during 2019. But what I would say is that in those cases, none of the people that were involved, none of the people that were shot by police officers were African Americans. We had one Hispanic, and then there's a breakdown of two Asians, and the others were Caucasian. But in each of those instances, it involved an individual or person who either shot around at our police officers, pointed a gun at our police officers, or attacked the police officer with a knife. And so in those cases, our officers only used lethal force in order to defend their own lives against a violent attack on them. I think you've seen the body-worn camera video of every one of them. I think I was very forthcoming and being very transparent in putting that body-worn camera video out very quickly after those incidents happened, because I wanted to make sure that the community knew exactly what took place and why my officers took the actions that they took. So that I would encourage you to go back and encourage people to go back and look at that, because in many instances, we took criticism from fellow law enforcement officers across the nation who said, you waited too long and you should have used force way sooner than that. And so I think if you look back at it and give it an honest review, that you'll come to the same conclusion that so many others have, and that was the officers used lethal force only when it was absolutely necessary to protect their own lives. I will tell you that in each of those cases, we brought in the Georgia Bureau of Investigations to handle the investigation of that officer-involved shooting. That's our standard practice, because we want an independent third party looking at our actions. And I think that that increases the trust and credibility in the final investigation when it's someone other than ourselves doing that kind of investigation. The Georgia Bureau of Investigations in all of those cases found that the officers' use of force was both legal and appropriate given the circumstances they were confronted with. They turned their investigative file over to the district attorney. And at the time, it was Ken Malden, who was the district attorney. And the district attorney, Ken Malden, came back with his final conclusions in all 6 of those cases that indicated that the officer's use of force was justifiable and appropriate and in their own self-defense. And so so certainly 6 shootings is something that would draw anybody's attention, but I think it's been vetted out. Those have been looked at by all sources and concluded to be proper and appropriate. Even with that being said, as a police chief and the head of a law enforcement organization, even if it is justifiable, I think I have an obligation to try to prevent the loss of life and the use of deadly force whenever possible. And when I saw what was happening, I looked at the training, I looked at the equipment and tools and policies that we had in place to try to see what adjustments I could make. Even though we were authorizing and using the force, I still wanted to make sure that I did everything I could to try to prevent something like that from happening in the future. We know in the difficult job we do that it is going to happen, but we wanted to mitigate or minimize the number of times that it happened. And so I changed some policy as far as making sure that our officers were staging before they went into a situation where a person was said to be armed, that they considered additional tactics, which included the use of a taser when time and circumstances allowed for that, and de-escalation whenever possible. I also required the entire police department to go through what's called ICAT training, that's Integrated Communications Assessment and Tactics Training. It's national best practice training that is developed by the Police Executive Research Forum, and where it's geared to do exactly that, to teach officers skills so that they can use to de-escalate and prevent from having to get into a deadly force situation with an individual who is in mental crisis and who is armed. And so all of that training, we do regular crisis intervention training also, every officer that comes through our department, and that's to teach our officers how to deal with people who are mentally ill. And so we have, in addition to that, an advanced crisis intervention training that we give to our officers also. So we're taking a lot of steps to deal with this issue of mental illness, which was the underlying factor that resulted in the officer-involved shootings that took place last year. Not the relationship between African Americans and the police department.
I just want to clarify something real quickly before you continue, Chief. So the reason for asking about that is because part of the reason why the commissioner is proposing this was based off of those police shootings and exactly what you just said, which was the fact that there was mental health involved in these police shootings. And so her case is that instead of the police department carrying that burden of having to play, mental health expert on the scene and being a social worker on the scene, the money should be directed towards those who are trained in that area as professionals, so that police can focus on other areas instead of having to be the mental health experts on the scene and having to be the social worker on the scene. So that's the reason for asking about that.
Yeah, I think I can answer that. I guess I might as well take the question while it's there, and that is because, so when you're dealing with a person who's armed with a knife or armed with a striking instrument, yes, and that person is suffering through mental crisis or mental illness, you certainly want to have mental health clinicians, professionals who are skilled to try to intervene and talk the person out of it. But you also have to balance that against the danger that that person may be posing to the community or even to that mental health clinician who's trying to defuse the situation. And so Athens-Clarke County came up with what I consider a brilliant concept, which has been looked at all across the state and across the nation as a model policy, where we have mental health co-responders teams, where we have specially trained officers who are teamed up with a mental health clinician, and they do exactly what you're just talking about. When they have a a call that involves something like that, then they respond together. And so that's doing exactly what the commissioner was referencing. In addition to that, the co-responder team, we had one. We realized that as our number of mentally ill people in our community continues to grow, that we needed to grow that unit also. And so we went with the second co-responder team that just started up a few months ago. So we have two co-responder teams now that incorporate exactly what the commissioner was talking about, where
Did
we've
they
got.
respond to any of the 6 shootings from last year?
So what happened last year was they did not respond to any of the 6 shootings from last year. One of the problems is that those things unfold so quickly that being able to have the resources there and on scene, or get them to the scene in time for them to be engaged or to intervene, is very difficult. So I think there's some room for us to look at that, to even look at increasing the number of mental health clinicians and co-responder teams that we have. But I don't believe that should be the dismantling or the downsizing of the police department.
So it sounds like you do agree with parts of what she's proposing, because that's what one of the things she proposed. Okay,
Absolutely.
talk about the parts you agree with and the parts you don't agree with.
Yeah, so the parts that I agree with is, so first let me say this to you. As a African-American police chief, and having come out of poverty and come out of communities that are ravaged by crime and drug trafficking and violence and guns, I realize how critically important it is for us to have an effective law enforcement agency or effective police department to address violence, gangs, guns, and high-level offenses. But I also realize that everybody in these communities of color are not the enemy. And so we've got to balance our approach to make sure that we are dealing with the crime and violence that's going on, and not disenfranchise or include all the other people who are not being involved in crime. I get that. The parts of it that I agree with Mariah or with the commissioner are simple. I think that we need to have more resources dedicated towards dealing with the whole mental health issue. I think that we need to view drug addiction as a health crisis, as opposed to a criminal crisis, a crime issue, because a person who is addicted to drugs, if you arrest that person and put them in jail, and they stay in jail for 6 months or however long, and you get them no treatment, and you put them right back out on the street, now they have an arrest record, so the likelihood that they're going to be able to get a job and sustain employment and take care of a family is even reduced. And so you're just creating a situation where that person's going to come back out and they're still addicted, and they're going to get right back into what they were doing before. So I absolutely agree that once we've interacted with a person and determined that they have a drug addiction, that jail is not the appropriate place for them. We should be looking for counseling, treatment, opportunities to get them off the drugs and get them back into a productive work life. The same thing with mental illness. We had facilities and places where a person who was suffering through mental illness could go in, get some in-house treatment, get somebody that would monitor them and take care of them. And when those broke down and are no longer available, then the next thing you know, you've got them on the street and they get arrested and they're in jail, and then the jail say, well, wait a minute, they're mentally ill. We got no place for them here. So then they wind up out in the street, and then they wind up in crisis. And now my officers are staring at them with a knife or a gun in their hand. And that's when things go south. So I absolutely agree that we should be pushing those people towards treatment programs, medication, opportunities to get them help rather than incarceration. Extreme poverty in our communities. We've got the effects of extreme poverty in our communities on our youth is appalling. We've got young people who, by the time they're 13 or 14 years old, they've made a decision that there is nothing. The American dream is not achievable for them. And so they've got to do what they've got to do by any means necessary to survive. And so the way to address that is not to continue the school to prison pipeline and put them in jail. The way to address that is to get them programs, to get them mentor programs, to have somebody talking to them that tell them you can be a police chief, you can be a congressman, you can be the president of the United States, and here's the path to get there, and not just tell them, but help them get there. Give them, so creating a vision that they believe that they can move from where they are and have share the American dream. I think that's the answer. So all of the programs, the programs and opportunities and treatment and counseling and all those things that that the commissioner is talking about, we do need to invest more in those. I'm not saying not to, but here's the problem. If you do that by tearing down the police department, then you will basically create a state of lawlessness. If we already are struggling to keep up with crime, our violent crime and aggravated assaults are on the increase. Matter of fact, if you remember this summer, we had a shooting where a young lady was standing out, pregnant, standing out in front of her house in Clark Gardens and was shot and killed and lost the baby as well. Last night, I had a shooting incident where a pregnant young lady was shot in the chest. And so guns are out there. Thankfully, she lived, but guns are out there. Violence is out there. And so we can't leave a community unprotected for the sake of overdoing it in another with social programs and things like that.
And Chief, I just want to correct something real quickly, or just mention something real quickly. So she's not calling for the entire police department to be disbanded the way Minneapolis has done so. What she told me in our conversations and in her proposal is that they would decrease, basically, hold on one second. Let me read it exactly as.
I saw it. I know what she's saying. She wants to decrease by 50%.
Correct.
Over a time period.
Right.
What I would say is that's just a shotgun approach to looking at how to do something. If we're going to think about decreasing the police department, we need to look at what our challenges are, what our needs are, and be thoughtful about what percentage, if any, needs to be reduced, and then do it based off of that, not just say we're going to chop everything in half. Remember, if you cut the police department in half, that's going to result in a situation where my officers may not have backups when they go on calls for service. So now you're creating a more dangerous situation for my officer, where if something, so that was one of the reasons why I changed the policy with respect to officers staging outside the area and waiting on backups and thinking about tactics before they go in when they're dealing with somebody with a knife.
And Chief, we're going to have to wrap up soon, but I just want to make sure I also mentioned another thing you said. I have two more things to ask you.
Okay.
You also mentioned crime stats going up. However, the stats that were shared with me, are you saying those are wrong? Because I sent it back to your office to confirm. According to the commissioner, who says that they received these numbers from through an open records request, which I sent to your office to see if I could get confirmed. They said crimes against persons are down 2.4% from 2019 year to date. Assault crimes are steadily decreasing. Property crimes are going down. Burglaries are going down by 16%. Larceny of motor vehicles down by 27%. Robberies are down by 44%, all within the last year, despite the vacancies that you have now. Are you saying that all those numbers are wrong?
No, absolutely. I'm not saying that those numbers are wrong. I'm saying that in 2019, compared to the years past, crime was up. And so, and then also when you look at aggravated assaults where people are shooting other people, gun offenses, those kinds of offenses are up. When you look at commercial burglaries, those offenses are up. So while burglary overall is down, you have certain things that are trending where crime is continuing to go up in certain areas. And so
I just want to make sure I understand that correctly. So when they say, for example, crime against persons are down 2.4% from 2019 year to date.
That's accurate. That is accurate. But when you look at aggravated assaults alone, and when you look at guns, where incidents involving people shooting and gun incidents, those are up.
And then Okay, and then robberies, are they down 44%?
That's correct, they are.
And
But
that's compared from 2019 to now, correct?
I don't have the numbers here in front of me. I know that they are going down, but the reason that they're going down is because we have police officers that are being committed in a way and a strategy that we're using now to deal with things to drive the crime down. And so when you look at the fact that they're down compared to last year, you have to remember that last year crime was up. So you got to look at it in a 5-year, look at it over a 5-year period. And some things are down, but again, when you look at homicides, I can tell you last year we had a young man that was waiting on a bus stop to go to college in the morning, was shot in the head. So robberies are down, but we still have some pretty serious crime. You had Ariel Calloway, who was shot in front of her house, and her baby died. And then last night, again, you had another case where a person was shot in the chest, a pregnant female. So I think we have to have a more thoughtful process to look at what our department looks like, where we can cut if necessary, and do it in a more thoughtful manner. The other thing is if I don't have the resources, we can't engage in community-oriented policing and 21st century policing, because that's labor intensive. I got to have uncommitted time where the officers can get out of the car, engage with the community, pick a kid up and take that kid to the barbershop to get a haircut, or take them shopping around the Christmas holiday. And all of those things require you to have staffing. So I think we need to be much more thoughtful than just simply saying that 50% model may work for some police departments. But at the end of the day, it's got to be done in a more thoughtful and strategic manner if we're talking about cutting the seat. And by the way, I've been to many community meetings where I've talked with people in the community.
And actually, Chief, I have a question about that. So in my conversations with Commissioner Parker, she said for 2 weeks now, she's been trying to sit down with you and have a conversation as you're having with me to see what you agree with, what you don't agree with. And as of last night, she hadn't heard back from you. So she wanted to get your opinion and your thoughts on the proposal. And she says she can't get you to sit down with her.
I don't recall any message. I could have missed a message, but I don't recall any message or any invite to sit down with her. I'm certainly willing to do that, sit down with her and anybody and talk about that issue. I think it's something that's necessary, and I want her to know how I feel, because I think, as you heard earlier, I do agree with her in a number of areas. What I will tell you, though, is that I've gone out and I've been in the community. I've held multiple community meetings, talked with people, and I don't see the community saying, we want to cut our police department. I hear them saying we want criminal justice reform. I hear them saying I want to build trust and legitimacy with the police department. I want to make sure everyone is being treated fairly and with dignity and respect. But we want more programs and more opportunities for our police department to engage in our communities. So I'm not hearing from the community them saying that they want to cut our department in half.